So we are here in a new episode of Light Night Anarchy, and we have as guest Pekka Kolehmainen, who is a Ph.D. candidate in cultural history at the University of Turku in Finland, and it has been working about the relationship between rock and politics in American history. So first of all, how you came to that subject of research, which is very interesting. I always have think that someone should do it, but I haven't read much about it.
Yeah, it's a very interesting field. Like my special focus is sort of on the 1980s and 1990s situation, which is not so often researched. I feel like a lot of the sort of rock scholarship tends to focus on the 60s and the 70s, which perhaps were the more prominent rock music eras in US history. So I'm sort of going with the 80s and 90s, and I think I sort of came to it because, simply from sort of personal history, I suppose. I was a heavy metal listener when I was growing up, and I was very interested in these sort of, I guess, moral panics around rock music. And the most prominent one, I suppose, would be the sort of the 1985 when you had the Parents Music Resource Center, or PMRC, came into being in the United States, and it was formed by a number of prominent wives of prominent politicians in US. So, for example, Tipper Gore is, I suppose, the most well-known, the wife of Al Gore, who was a senator at the time. And they started pressuring the Recording Industry Association of America into adopting these warning labels on the sort of explicit rock music, the sort of rock that was seen as containing material that was too explicit, the material that was too obscene, and was seen as sort of harmful to youth in general. And that's the sort of point where I first entered into this topic. I was very interested in that whole media event that took place around PMRC, which sort of culminated in September 1985 when you had the Senate hearing by a Senate committee on the topic of explicit lyrics. And you had, for example, Al Gore himself on the committee there hearing PMRC and some of their experts, as well as Frank Zappa and Dee Snider from the band Twisted Sister and John Denver were there as sort of representatives of rock music. I don't know if John Denver counted, but anyway, that's sort of where I got into it, and I've sort of been expanding from that into this general interest of how rock has been discussed about. Like, for example, my current work, the Ph.D. that I'm doing, I'm not so much focused on, for example, particular bands, particular genres, that kind of thing. I'm very interested in sort of the abstract idea of rock. What do we think about when we say rock in this particular time, the 1980s and 1990s, and what sort of political discussions does that go into at that time?
Yeah, I guess that, here in Peru and Latin America in general, in the 80s it was punk, the most thing that I come to realize that the few things that have been bright and in more way academic about recent music is about punk, and it's very subversive bands, like have bands like very anarchist leanings, and it's funny because I mean, some of these bands never had any kind of success. I mean, never even play on the radio, and there have been bands that have been quite relatively popular, and despite that, they never have written about that. So yeah, it's an interesting. It's the 80s is a period I don't know as much as the 90s, but I think that I remember, I don't know if it is true, that in the documentary when they mentioned the new wave was kind of punk, but because they buy Warner Brothers, or I don't remember which label, buy a bunch of punk labels and try to market it in a very different way. I don't know if you know that story better.
Yeah, I mean, the new wave phenomenon, I think, from a US perspective is kind of interesting. I don't know about that particular case, but for example, I've noticed a lot when I've been going, because I mostly go through media discussions. I use lots of print media, especially how they discuss rock music. And there's especially in the early 1980s, when you had this sort of arrival of new wave, and it was sort of at times called the second British invasion. Of course, those kind of labels are always a bit like, as any imposition of an era, or the sort of notion of this being an era, it's always a bit artificial, but that was one of the ways that it's been talked about. And there was this sense of here they come again kind of thing, the sort of British new wave bands that had been formed out of punk, or sort of moved into a different kind of musical expression, that they are coming again. And sort of there was this, I guess, slight tinge of moral panic in the United States around the early 1980s about the coming of more of this British influence, because there were artists in US who and other rock commentators and other people just generally who were interested in rock music or thought about rock music. There was at times this sense that the British had sort of taken rock music from the United States, that in the 1960s with the British invasion, that the Beatles had sort of come and taken over this art form, and all the sort of stuff that happened after Beatles, that it had been sort of taken over by the British influences, whereas there was a sense that rock music should be an American form of music. It should be something that was fundamentally about the US, and there was this notion that here they come again with this new wave music. And I think that's an interesting point you made earlier about the whole punk not really like necessarily being these big bands, but they were still written about. And I think that sort of comes with if you look at much of academic scholarship, there's been so much written material about punk, because that sort of grasps people in still. There's something about punk that invites people to write about it and study it. And personally, going on a purely subjective level, I've never been a punk person. so I go at sort of different kinds of understandings of what rock is, and punk is part of that. Heavy metal is part of that. In my work, I also consider a little bit about hip hop and rap as part of that, because even though I suppose if you go from it from a sort of musical standpoint, you necessarily wouldn't connect hip hop with rock music as such. But in the sort of contemporary time period of the 1980s, when people were talking about rock music, they were often talking also about hip hop with the sort of rock terminology. That's one of my points of interest, is sort of what is contained within the concept of rock at this time period, what was put inside it. And it had a very large variety of bands, going from like Madonna was often talked about as rock, even though we would classify her much more as a pop artist. And then you go to Prince, and through Prince you go to Bruce Springsteen. You go from Bruce Springsteen to Twisted Sister, you go to Slayer, you go to Public Enemy. And all of these artists from this massive range were still on some level often talked about as simply rock. And that's, for me, a point of interest in how those different connections are being made at that time.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to label a band, especially these days, because sometimes we listen to so many things that we think that band also listened to that, and that's not necessarily the case. And I guess that there is something about the censorship that I was curious. I don't know if you have research about that, but why in the 90s there was a lot of times two versions of music videos? Because what I know is that the Cardigans, I think one video has nudity, and for that reason, I think they didn't broadcast that music video in the US, but I don't remember which song, but that's what I once heard something about.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely happened, and that also happened with record covers, because you would have, for example, the version that was the artist's own version, and then the recording label went like, no, we can't put that out, we have to make this other version. Like, I think White Zombie had some cases of that, where they their album covers had to be changed. And I think that was there was a very prominent time period. I think that's why I'm sort of trying to consider 1980s with the 1990s. Often there's this sense that there was something very different about 1980s compared to the 1990s. But I think a lot of these things flowed into across the decade, sort of, and it was very, I think, by the end of 1990s, there was a sense that this was natural, this was normal on some level. This was understandable that you would want to make sure that young people wouldn't get exposed to, for example, these videos. They wouldn't be able to access these records. Whereas in 1985, when PMRC first started putting these things out there, and of course they didn't invent the idea. There have been, of course, moral panics around rock music since the 1950s. It wasn't like they came out of nowhere. But I think at that point it was still regarded as fairly ridiculous proposition. The PMRC were very much widely mocked, and if you look at, I think Time magazine did a polling on its readers, like, what do you feel about PMRC's goals of labeling rock music, and largely the reader base was against it. But by the time you come to the late 1990s, I think this was then becoming much more commonplace, was this idea that you would want to sort of curate what gets out there, and sometimes that would involve having sort of the parallel elements or parallel versions.
Yeah, that's an interesting kind of point, and sometimes it's I guess that 90s was a very particular time in music, because it's very diverse. As someone who was born in the 90s, even here in Peru, the kind of music that came was fairly diverse, from the early grunge, from the alternative rock scene, from the most electronic kind of things. And you had like mediums like MTV, where basically everything. I guess that some kinds of metal and some kinds of punk, they didn't there, but to a general degree, they were fairly more open than these days are. General, the last remaining music video channels, or even the most mainstream radios, and I didn't know how to explain that why there was a lot of openness to new kind of genres, to new kind of styles. Even Apex Twin was a very kind of strange kind of bands that had some kind of success, even if they were experimental in some ways, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's the sort of thing that I think was it started, I think, in the early 1980s already, because there was this, if you go to the rock writing, let's say, from the early 1980s, and you had this sense of a void there, because you had punk in the late 1970s sort of rising, but that sort of had a little bit fizzled out. Of course, it continued going on in different forms, but it wasn't like this big thing. And then you had disco also at the late 1970s, similar kind of big mainstream thing that just dominated sort of music culture. And then you come to the 1980s and you didn't really have similar kind of thing. You started having these waves of things. You had, as you come to the middle of the decade, you had heavy metal. Then you go to the later 1980s and you had the stronger rise of rap and hip hop, obviously. Well, again, roots go much beyond late 1980s, but that's sort of when it started growing, at least in terms, for example, MTV is a very, very good example in terms that in the 1980s it was very much constantly broadening its scope. If you go to the early, like 1983, 19 to 1985, it was very small scope of what MTV would broadcast. Then it would start bringing in more variety. And I think that sort of splintering is what started happening in the late 1990s. And at the same time, the genres started getting a bit muddier. There wasn't this sense of different artists borrowing from different things. Like you started having heavy metal guitars in pop songs and stuff like that much more commonly than perhaps before. You had electronic influences going in. So I think that definitely, once you get to the 1990s, you definitely did have that much wider variety, and I'm not sure it can be very easily pinpointed to any specific thing that was taking place at the time. Obviously, technology was part of it. For example, MTV had started broadening up its scale a little bit. You had, I think, one of the big things that again goes back to the 1980s was the arrival of first the Sony Walkman and then the other those kinds of devices that allowed you to very much sort of decide what you wanted to listen to and when you wanted to listen to it, as opposed to before when you were much more constrained by what you had available, what kind of environment you were in, were you able to put on a record, that kind of thing. Whereas with Sony Walkman and these other portable players, you could just have whatever you wanted with you. Well, obviously, depending on whether you could get access to it in the first place, but you could generally speaking do that. And I think that's a lot of these different factors sort of came into play there. And I think at least on some level, 1990s saw the larger sort of cultural splintering in the United States as well. You had the Bill Clinton era US appearing as a much more of a permissive, much more of a place that was more open to different kinds of self-expressions than perhaps had been the general atmosphere of the Ronald Reagan and to some extent also George Bush the Senior's era, when there was a greater sense of a conservative resurgence and returning to the sort of much more of a singular cultural forms dominating. So I think there's a lot of these different strands that take place there.
But how you will explain the end of the era? Because I think that from the late 90s and to the early 2000s, like the music scene became much more narrow, focused on Britney Spears and boy bands and things like that, and kind of it never. I mean, I know that Letterman or the big shows still have some indie bands playing, but to the degree that you could that bands like Smashing Pumpkins or Garbage are no longer as mainstream as they were in the 90s, or spy or other kinds of music, like the more massive music is pop now, like it's not, it becomes much more narrow, and the kind of, or metal even, or punk even, have the same kind of a space than in the 90s. What was the thing that switched? Because one could say that 9/11, but I sometimes feel that even from 1999, it was like the alternative scene was seeing a decline. Could it be the piracy that was kind of playing its role, and the new labels don't know what to do, or was it a other thing?
I think there's a lot of elements there. I think a couple of things. One would be perhaps I would point to what was the sort of general tone towards leisure. What was the dominant sort of popular cultural form in these times? Because I feel like on some level in the sort of larger atmosphere, I think, or larger cultural forces, the prominence of music in the lives of people, I think, on some level could be argued that it started fading. You had, for example, video games became a much more of a much bigger element in, for example, the way that young people conducted their lives. You had these different things sort of competing for space, competing for space and competing for time in the way that people dedicated their time to. I think also, quite simply, the prominence of internet, the prominence of later social media, I think could contribute to the sense that localities became less important. I think that's hello? I think I had a small break in my connection there, but I think sort of the online online spaces, they provided this ability to connect you with people from different parts of the world. So I think a lot of that sort of things that had been previously created music scenes in particular geographical areas, that sort of grassrootsy kind of culture, I think that became less localized, and you started doing it more online, which I think sort of dispersed the whole thing a little bit. I think that would be part of it. Beyond that, you could also point to, for example, differences in the way that people conducted themselves in making music. I think the sensibility of, for example, how you break out, how that sort of notion that you put the band together, you go and play gigs, and you start to try to get a record deal, and you send demos out. That kind of thing started becoming old-fashioned. You had now these new ways of getting audience that necessarily did not mean that you had to go through the previous channels, go through these big channels. So I think that sort of led that there's a lot more variety. There's a lot of splintered things happening, but none of them gained the sort of critical mass to rise to the point where outside of this pop music sphere. And I think those kinds of elements would contribute towards that that splintering, that there's no real these big things, I suppose you could say, happening in terms of big cultural events or big musical forces. And I think also there is simply that rock connected as again, rock as an idea, rock as a sort of abstract notion, it connected to a very particular political atmosphere that I don't know if it simply moved away. I personally have never really liked the notion of rock dying. There's always this discussion of when did rock die? When did it stop being whatever it was supposed to be? But I do think that at some point rock stopped having that function that it had, I think, still in the 1980s and still in the 1990s. It still carried the sense of I guess rebellions. It carried the sense of breaking certain norms, at least, and carrying this certain temperament towards the world. And I think that became increasingly it had increasingly less demand, perhaps, in the recent times, or perhaps these things were found elsewhere than in necessarily rock. I think these are important concepts, but I don't think I have like a very clear this is it kind of answer to the question. It's a very interesting question, definitely, and something worth thinking about. Like that's perhaps one reason also why I'm sticking with the 1990s, is that I start thinking about coming to the 2000s and what was the role of rock there, and it becomes a lot more elusive. You have much less of a sense what was it at that point in time anymore. It becomes diluted, I think.
Yeah, I was thinking also to the role about history as in the history of rock, particularly the more recent rock, in some kind of expansion of American culture, because there was an academic in Colombia, a professor of philosophy there, which had the idea that he always said, when he go and talk about, especially in the 90s, about the crisis and from contemporary, about how the idea of American culture as a global culture, and that to a certain degree American culture will be a global culture, at least particularly to the middle class, at least to the more English-speaking world. And it was kind of strange, because Peru, it has a very different. It was a very strange time, because rock was quite popular in the 90s here, like no other time before. I mean, rock was on the radio. it was a very strange time to be, because and but I feel that that kind of discourse started to fade away when, at least here in Peru and in general in Latin America, reggaeton started to have a place and kind of replace it, rock culture and its influence, and kind of the 2000s, the people try to talk about the indie instead of just rock, like trying to gain an idea of an identity rather than just talking about rock per se, like indie, or people call themselves punks or metal, but not just rock, and how you see that that crisis, that was kind of like pop became the center, but in some parts pop was not as accepted as rock was, in kind of the, as rock as a more rebellious music for the youth, and kind of the rebellions were in other places.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very interesting question to sort of think about this differentiation between rock and pop, because on some level this stuff changes. I think recently I've been writing an article, or I've been working on the Beach Boys, for example, and that's one of those things where you would constantly these days, when you write about Beach Boys as a rock band, you would often get this question of, well, are they really, are they rock, are they pop? It's a very sort of mellow sound to it that people these days don't necessarily associate with rock. And obviously, when Beach Boys started their career, rock and pop were very much together in the late 50s. Rock was largely again becoming sort of inseparable from pop in that brief period of time. And I think when some of these distinctions between rock and pop are arbitrary. You have certain things that you would easily classify as rock. You have some things that you would easily classify as pop. But then again, you can go to like heavy metal, is that some people don't necessarily consider heavy metal rock. They consider it something that spun from rock or came from rock, especially hard rock. But whether it's rock as such or something else, that's always a point of debate. And I think there is this sense that rock did stand for a certain sense of Americanness, certain sort of US culture that was spreading, and obviously it had British influences much there as well, but there was a sense of rock and Americanness there. It was a very middle class exercise, I think, especially in the US. If you go to Britain, then it's in many cases different. And rock also in the US had some working class connections. But anyway, I think on some basic level, it was a middle class exercise. And I think it's I lost my train of thought there. I got in this weird ramble. What was the original question that I started to answer again?
Yeah, but I think you more or less answered it. But
okay, that's good.
The other thing that I was to ask you is, what you have been working about the relationship between conservatism and rock, like how they have seen it, but how you see the connection between the most reactionary stuff and sometimes punk or metal bands trying to embrace some kind of sometimes fascist, sometimes white supremacist measures. So how was the difference between then and now in that kind of?
That's something that I am not currently considering a whole lot. Like a lot of if you go to what I do in my PhD dissertation, I'm following, for example, some political magazines from the 1980s and 1990s, from both conservative and the more, I guess, liberal side of the political spectrum. And I'm looking at some daily newspaper from around the country. And in those kinds of materials, you would not necessarily get that, because get that white supremacist element there. I think obviously certain rock cultures have been very prominent there, and I think rock has uneasy place there in the certain sense that there is a sort of, I guess, masculinity and aggression built into the rebelliousness of rock that I think makes it a fairly easy place to also address sort of these white supremacist places. And I know, for example, in the more, I guess, European context, and I suppose also in the US, of course, there's been quite many rock subcultures where rock concerts have been used as a recruitment ground for white supremacist groups, and where it has been used as this gateway to sort of put these ideas into the people listening to the music. In my own research, that's not a huge issue. I'm more, I guess, looking at the sort of mainstream conservatism and the different elements there. For example, there's the evangelical conservatism, the neoconservatism, and it is how these different elements of conservatism both look to co-opt and both reacted against rock. And I think that sort of there is a sort of reactionarism to much of conservatism, in my opinion, and rock both can be used as a tool in that reactionaryism. As said, if you by the time you come to the 1980s, rock was like it had been around for 25 years. It wasn't exactly a new cultural form at that point in time, so it's easy to take a certain kind of certain kind of idea of rock and instill that as a sense of what United States is about. But the sort of very far right, the very far conservatism angle is not something I'm very much focused in the 1980s and 1990s, but it's of course a very important topic on this field as well, and especially once you come to especially once you come to Europe, where I think in the sort of black metal scenes there's been a much more of a presence of far right elements and stuff like that. So it's part of it, but it's not something that I'm directly focused on. But I am interested in the sort of questions about sense of a loss of a culture, the loss of sense of loss of these fundamental pillars of, for example, Western society, which I think were prominent in 1980s and 1990s conservatism, which then again feed into, especially these days, feed into the sort of far right and neo-fascist tendencies, the same kind of element of lost culture, the lost civilization kind of elements that are very much recurring, I think, in both of these branch of conservatism, let's put it that way.
Okay, so the other question is how is studying American history from overseas? Because I mean, here in Peru and in large part of Latin America, basically most historians work Latin American history, and the ones that study the U.S. study relationship. For example, there's a guy in Chile works the relationship between Chile and the United States and things like that. Like, it's not necessarily about American history per se, the ones that study somehow United States. So how is that in Finland or in the Nordic countries, in Europe in general? It's much easier to study, I guess, because it's more open.
It's more open. I think there's a very much difference in different parts of Europe. I guess it's maybe more uniform against Nordic, but obviously I'm mostly talking from Finnish perspective myself. It's not uncommon to study non-Finnish subjects here. There is, for example, if you go to the way that my university has sort of divided history up, there's 3 history departments. Well, there's actually 5, but 3 are the main history departments. There's Finnish history, there's European and world history, I think they're called in English, and then there's mine, the cultural history. So Finnish history has its own department, and then you have the sort of world history, European history department, and then you have cultural history. I suppose that's the odd child who can do basically whatever. and we do kind of whatever. We have lots of people who study Finnish subjects. We have lots of people who study completely something else. For example, currently in cultural history, we have 3 PhD candidates working on US history. We have me, and I have a colleague who works on FBI and its relationship to Black Panther as well as KKK in the 1960s, sort of the racial politics of that combination. And then I have a friend who studies atheist women in the 19th century. So we do have US studies here, and we have also in our university we do have you can study North American studies as a minor if you so want. I didn't ever do that myself. That wasn't part of because I came to my topic from the sort of musicology and media studies side rather than US history. US history sort of came to it, well, okay, I need to discuss this US history because I'm talking about this particular subject, and I've sort of spanned from there. But we do also have, for example, we have John Morton Center for North American Studies, which very specifically focuses on the study of United States, Canada, Mexico, and actually Cuba recently, although even if that doesn't necessarily usually go with North American subjects. But it's much easier, but you do always have that sense, which always annoys me personally, is that when you go to, for example, a Finnish gathering of researchers, or you just talk about your subject in sort of general sense, there's always this question of, well, how was this also in Finland? And I've never been a fan of that question. I go, well, I study US history. I studied this particular thing happening in the United States. I'm not really that the expert to talk about this in Finland. I leave that to someone else to do. But on some level, you are expected to always sort of bring up the Finnish context, also know at least the Finnish situation in regards to a lot of these topics that you study. So it's a bit of it's not nearly the same in the sense that you are free to choose your own subject from very early on in your studies. Finnish university is fairly oriented towards research, so students usually pick their own topics that they are interested in, and they pursue sort of research from a very early on in their studies, and they are free to pick courses and minors that complement their interests there, and they are free to do it for whatever country they are interested in. So in my case, it has been the United States, and I think as a student, I didn't, I guess, identify myself as so much studying US history. Like I said, I was interested in sort of moral panics around music, and United States simply offers a very fertile ground for that kind of interest, because there's a lot of these interesting conservative politics mixed together, which don't necessarily get the same kind of expression in Europe, where on some level I think politics are more subdued. There are less of these, I guess, wild ideologies here, even though some of the elements are the same, but they're not quite as pronounced as, for example, in the US. So US was simply an interesting place to do it, and so US element sort of it snuck by. Now as a PhD candidate, I'm much more oriented myself towards the idea that I study the United States, and I do more largely US history, and especially history of conservatism and these kinds of things. So it's quite possible. Obviously, there's challenges, for example, in research materials. You don't have oftentimes this. Well, our library system is fairly good, and you can usually, if you need a specific book, you can just have them order it, and they are very good also at hunting down some hard to get books as well. But and they're also fairly, if there's like a online database that gives you access to specific media materials, they usually at least consider getting it, or they can get like a trial for it, so you can at least use it for a short amount of time. So it's supported, but obviously certain subjects you will need to go to the United States to do that study. So a lot of PhD candidates have to build that into their proposal here, that you have to get some way of going to the United States for archival research to do your study.
Yeah, I understand that. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of sad that Latin America hasn't focused on US history much. I mean, with the exception of Argentina, I think. Actually it was because it was in Argentina. We study American history, and then he go back, and he already had a PhD in American history. So, well, he basically was an expert in American history. He started teaching that. But the other, I mean, general in Latin America, the ones that study American history, as I said, is the ones that had tried to relate the American history with Latin American history, like bilateral relationships particularly. And yeah, actually, Cuba has a Center for American Studies, but it's very strange. As far as one professor who teach American history here told me once. But yeah, I think it's very. I mean, it's the how is and in not just Finland, in Nordic countries, because there is like I see there are events like on American studies, so there are gatherings and things like that. Here in Latin America, they have tried to create an association of American studies, but they have failed because there are so few historians basically there are the only ones that have cared about the United States are basically historians, because I mean, it's very funny, but sometimes English literature. I mean, when there are courses in English literature, they literally dictate English literature, not even American. I mean, it's literature in English theory, but anyway. So yeah, basically the only ones that are some historians, and they have problems in trying to create an association or something like that. So how works in the Nordic countries that kind of collaboration of events and that kind of subject?
It's fairly good. We have a Finnish Association for North American Studies, and that is part of a Nordic Association for American Studies, and that is part of a European Association of American Studies. So you have this yearly, like it's every second year. It's just a Finnish association. Like this year, it's actually pretty much 1 month from now in Helsinki. There is the conference for the Finnish Association of North American Studies, although that also has a lot of US scholars, a lot of international scholars coming. So it's not just Finnish researchers usually, but it's sort of the Finnish brand's own conference. And then every second year there's the Nordic versions somewhere in the Nordic countries. Like last year it was in Denmark. So they're fairly nice conferences, and I think it's fairly extensive. There is the same sort of dominance. I feel like a lot of the subjects are what I would call, and this is maybe a little bit unfair, the traditional history. So, for example, I'm a cultural historian. I do a lot of popular culture things, which I'm not saying they are completely foreign to that kind of audience, but it's not as pronounced as the sort of traditionally. If you go, I think historically, if you go to what kind of history of United States, sort of American history has been done in Finland, I think you will find a lot of the same kind of themes as you mentioned it being in your place of the world, in terms that it's going to be Finnish migration to United States, that kind of Finland-US relations and things like that. But I think that's not so much the case these days. I think it's much more varied these days. And the other thing is US literature is a very big field also in the Finnish and Nordic associations for American studies. So those are really big elements of the study of United States here. But then we have other things, like, for example, I'm also part of the sort of popular culture studies scene, I suppose, in Finland. And cultural history at University of Turku has been very big in the study of popular culture as its own worthy subject, I suppose. And we have a strong tradition in that, and that has a lot of both European and US connections as well. So, I think the situation is fairly nice in that respect, and I think it's also has been improving a lot just over this period that I've been working on my PhD. Like, it's been much more prominent, and I think quite frankly, going into the elephant in the room in terms of, for example, getting funding for research. Of course, the current political situation in the US has been, it's harsh to say because I'm not a fan of the current political situation, but it has been beneficial for US studies in the sense that it's been much more, the funding agencies in Finland have been much more eager to fund research into the United States as of recent, because it's been a topic that has, been on people's mind quite a bit. So it has been easier, and I do think when you're preparing research project, there isn't this huge demand that you need to somehow link this to Finland. A lot of funding agencies and a lot of the sort of the gatekeepers of what gets done in Finland, they're happy to have Finnish research being conducted simply on US topic without that sort of connection to Finnish situation, which I think is a fairly positive thing, because I do think that there's a lot of value in general on research that comes from outside whatever it's researching. So, for example, a non-US person studying US history, and I'm also always very fascinated to hear non-Finnish research done about Finland, which is harder than US because there's always the language question. But whenever people do it, I'm also always very interested in it because I think it has some potential for some very fresh perspectives.
Yeah, actually, here in Peru, also a lot of the most important works in Peruvian history are not done by Peruvians. It's funny that it sounds, but yeah, it has been interesting having you, Pekka. So people could follow you on Twitter. You're there, right?
Yep. At PMKoleh, PMKOLEH is my handle there.
Okay, it has been great.
It has been nice to be here and talk about these things. It's been enjoyable. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks.